So a couple of things I wanted to make sure that we had covered here. One was, you can do this with a variety of methods, but I'm doing it with JSON, and the JSON that is native to FileMaker Pro. So what we're looking at here is a method for creating an export that doesn't necessarily follow the. It's the export that you can do that doesn't look like the export that you know and love. So this all begins with a couple of windows. I've figured out doing this is the easiest way for me to move back and forth between contexts and to just kind of know that you're going back and forth and easily do that. So I just create two windows, one for the data, one for the export. And I wanted to make a mention here. We ran into something recently where you can specify in 16, when you're making a new window, you can specify a layout within that step. Problem is, if you're not running 16, you get an unexpected result there. So whenever we make a new window, we should always follow that with a go to layout, even if you're in 16 and you don't have to. You get some real weird results if somebody opens that in anything other than 16, because they get a new window, but they don't go anywhere. So thought I'd mention that. So what's different about this is that we're going to make something that's a little more formatted, if you like, being able to add in things like a title line and header, even blank spaces, blank lines, column names, and so on. All of these things are things that are harder or impossible to do from within FileMaker natively. So what we're basically doing is going to export this data and build that export one line at a time. Obviously, at this point, when you're doing that export, you're going to be laying these lines out, and you're not going to want to resort this. This has to be built the way it will export. So sort your data before you do any sort of exports here. That'll become obvious here. One of the other things I'm doing in this is I'm actually going into one piece of data, one data set, and I'm pulling back a different found set for each kind of data that I'm after. And in this case, this is just a random sample that I went and grabbed some data, and it was Florida insurance data. And I saw a field called construction, and it's basically what's the building made of. And there were just 5 values there. So I thought, well, what if we made a different section of this export for each of those types? So what I want to do is to create a section for each kind of data and start each section with a line that describes it, maybe even says how many there are. So each time you do that find, you need to resort your data to make sure you're getting to the right set and in the right order. And I can't make enough about this. You have to visualize what you're doing here, because sometimes the way that you have this built is going to change the way you have to script it. And you really won't know that until you kind of start with exactly what you know you're going to build. And I have a picture of that here in a minute. So how many records do you have? How big is this process? When you loop through a script of an indeterminate number of records, it can sometimes create a performance issue. And I know we've all seen this, where you run a script and it loops through a bunch of records, and at some point it starts to slow down. And if there are enough records, it may slow down to a point where it doesn't work at all. And that's the reason I often will take the actual meat of this script, the creating of the JSON variable and the moving of that data over into the export. I actually make that a separate script. And the reason I do that is that when you run that script and then it ends, any memory used by that process is let go of. So that prevents the performance issues that we've seen with running a loop a lot of times. It could have happened here. I was dealing with 36,000 records in this sample data. Who knows? It depends on how much you're moving, how big it is, what kind of data, and so on. But I think you'll see as we go here that it's easy enough to do that, and actually makes it easier to think. So here's my mock-up. What I was saying is, when you look at this, you need to consider, what are we building? Do we need a title? Is there some header information at the top? Any blank lines? Do you want the column names in here? Is there a summary line, and so on? Totals, footers, all that kind of stuff. So when you're figuring out what it is you're building, you'll more easily know what the structure of that's going to need to be. And I'll tell you that where this began, and the reason I kind of came up with this all in the first place, was that I was building an export of invoice data for a major accounting system. And moving the data from the invoice table over to their system required a very specific shape for that data that the software company required. And what they wanted was the invoice data on one line and then all of its lines on the lines under it. So what you had was one line that had very specific data from the invoice, like the number and the date, so on. But the next line after that was the first line item of the invoice, and it had different fields. So including things like balance due for the entire invoice and how much was due on that line and so on. So it required grabbing all the data of an invoice and then going over to the export table and creating multiple lines per invoice and of different types. So it created a real mystery and a bit of a challenge for structuring that. But I think that's the end of that. Let's go look at our data. So what we have is, I guess we'll just go to the script. What I was doing here was, we can kind of see this. I don't even know if you can see this, but the whole structure of this thing is we create some windows first, make sure we're in the right space, and do some counting and so on. I'm going to set this aside for a minute and go look at the data itself, just so you can kind of see what's going on. We've got, let's see, this is the field I was talking about, the construction. So what I wanted to do was to find all the records that have this, and then you'll see that if we look at the kinds of things in here, we see that there's masonry and reinforced concrete and so on. These are all the different kinds of construction. So what we want to do is a find that finds all of the first kind and then the second kind and so on. But it all begins by running a script that will actually find the different kinds. I don't know how much detail we want to get into with this particular example. It's just, this is a particular method that I'm showing. The data is not that important, but what I was trying to show was that if we break this up, we can see that it makes a kind of a cool demo. But let's see here. I can actually just run this, I believe. If we start with this and just running it once and we see what the result is, we see bing, bang, boom. It's pretty much done in about 0.6 of a second. I went ahead and put a timer on it. So what we're seeing here is, as I laid it out, what you have at the beginning is a title, perhaps. I don't even know what the hell that is. That's the columns. No, that's not what I wanted. So what we have here is a title and a date. And then here's that summary record and some blank lines. But here you can see I've grabbed just 10 records out of this 13,482. And I'll show you the limiter that I put there for that. And here's another one, reinforced concrete and so on. I didn't grab all the data. I just wanted to show that you can do it this way. So this is what it built in 0.6 of a second. There's my timer. And that's the end. It shows 5 sections, each separated by a blank space and showing a summary remark here. So if we go back and look at the script for that, I don't know how easy it is to zoom on this. Can you see it okay? So I always do a couple of things. I think these are just good to do, but resetting globals at the top of your script just to make sure that those are cleared out. And I have a value here for how many are you going to have in each of those sections. So I have it doing 10, but this could easily be more, just that simple. So what it'll do is use that value when it's going through the loop below, set a path. And then the same thing here, I close the windows that I create in my script at the top so I don't end up with multiples. Just in case we, you know how it is, you run this thing halfway through and you end up with a stack of windows. So once these are closed, I then recreate them. Here's the export window. And you'll notice in here, in 16, I'm going to use layout export table right here in the line. but I also follow that up with a go to layout just in case we're using this in a different version than 16. Same thing with the data window. And then I create a variable here. This is an interesting technique, and you may know this well, but I want to mention it here for the recording. I'm getting the types from that construction, the construction field, and what I'm doing is going to a value list that I created in here. That is, it's based on the field. It's getting, obviously the value list will then have one of each of the values that are in that field. So I just use a function here called value list items. I tell it to just get the file name from this file, use this value list, and bring that back as a variable. This has the effect of just showing me all the values that are in there, and then lets me step through them as during a get value function. So next thing is to do a count. How many of those values are there, so that I know how many times to go through this loop. And I'm just doing a pattern count for the pilcrow, the return character in that list. But since there is not a return at the end of it, I have to add one. If you have a list of 5 items and you start counting returns, you're going to get to 4. So 4 plus 1. Then I'm setting a counter here for this loop. This loop just gets that label. Remember the reinforced concrete has this many records. This is how we build that. And it's just a quick little loop that goes 5 times through, in this case, and creates the variable called sum lines. And I also create another one that's just the counts, just the numbers themselves, and I can use those somewhere else. But that you could use that as a limiter on going through another loop. Anyway, so I do one here. This is where I'm actually breaking out separate scripts just to say, look, we're setting up an export. We're going to create a header. We just made scripts for that. And looking at that, let's say reset the export. Basically, we're just deleting everything in the export table. This is another one of those places where we can do this a couple of ways, but I wanted to make sure everybody's aware. There is a nifty little function called truncate table, which is much, much faster than delete all records. But it deletes all records. It doesn't delete the found set. It's important to note. If you're just needing to delete everything, this is a great way to do it. If you're trying to delete the found set, you'll want delete all records. But I was timing this with this script, and it's significantly faster to use truncate table if you don't have to delete a found set. If you are using an export table that is shared across all users, then obviously any records you create in the export table need to be marked with your username so that you can find those and delete them all. That way you can have one export table that's actually used across the entire system, and then that way other users don't affect one another. But in this case, I was using the truncate table function because I just wanted to delete everything. This just wipes it out. I'm also doing another here. Basically, I start with go to that window called export. If it doesn't exist, there'll be an error. If that window didn't exist and I were just truncating tables or deleting records, there would be a serious ramification. So we like to make sure if you're going to do something like go to a window and it's important that you're on that window, you might want to check and make sure there was an error or no error so that you can move on. Otherwise, you just show them a dialog, that window doesn't exist, and you bail. What else? The other one was the header, which is just, again, starts with finding the right window, and then, again, making sure that that window did exist and that you did get it. So the header is just one extra line at the top. We set a couple of fields, 3 blank lines, we're done. So that gets us through here. This last bit, let's see here. Get this window organized right. So the last piece is actually a double loop because we have to loop through getting a found set for each of those sections and then getting each bit of data for that section, then going back and doing another find. So basically what you have here is a loop that starts here, and in that loop we have, go to the data window. I have a couple of freezes in here that don't need to be here, but find mode, find the first type, get the value from the types for I is going to be 1 the first time through, and so on. Perform your find, And then once you have that find, we just run over to the export window and create a couple of lines and throw in our summary and switch back to the data window. So all we've done here is kind of created that summary bit between the sections. And then below here, the next thing we do is move to the data window, and then here's where it gets interesting. Perform the script export data line, which I suck at this. There we go. So what we do here is, the meat of this is really this. So we are basically setting one variable to every bit of data in that record. So that means we can just set this one variable, go over to the export side, and pull whatever we want by name, and not have to concern ourselves with, as we were saying earlier, we don't have to concern yourself with the order of these, or how many, or whether these things are even related. You can have one piece of JSON, and in fact, in that solution I was describing, the one record had both the invoice data and the line item data in one variable. So when I got over to the export side, I really only had to deal with that back and forth once. Once you're over on the export side, you just build out the records that you need based on the JSON data, and then you go back and get the next invoice. But by doing it that way, we have all that data in one variable, and the whole thing happens, in my mind, pretty quickly. It actually makes all of this seem very simple, because you just have one line here that says, well, just grab all the data at once. So, and I don't know, do we need to get into this? Because this is really, as complicated as this looks, it's really kind of simple, because there's really only 2 or 3 things here. One is, as we get started at the top, this one is just the JSON, and I could probably start at the top here by saying, if we were to, we can't do that here. Sorry. So if I were doing that in here, I might show the JSON things. So JSON get element and JSON set element are the 2 functions we use most. Get element is how we pull data out of a JSON array. Set element is how we put it in. Those are really the only 2 we need. By using these 2 functions, we have the ability to set and get all the data we need out of variables. So what you see about the JSON set element here is that it's asking for the JSON itself here. Now, when we're starting from scratch, we don't have any JSON. You can do this. You can actually do nothing at all here. That works too. Then the rest of this is key or index value and type, over and over and over, and that's all this is. So this is one piece of data, and all we're doing here is saying, what are you going to call it? Where does it come from? And what kind of data is it? By the way, this is mostly useless, but I do use it. I went ahead and told it that, this is an ID, and this is a number, this is a string. For the most part, these are strings, and when you're putting them into someplace and you need to coerce them into a certain type, you can certainly do that. You could wrap this whole thing in a get as date or get as number or something like that. But what you see is all we've done is just created line after line of grab this data, call it this, and you just separate those by semicolons. As long as these are well formed, each one being the same shape, different data, you can see here policy ID, state code, county, and so on. Once this is all set, it's a simple matter of doing the opposite on the other side, which is to go get it. So here is what that looks like. You can see that all we're really doing is using the JSON get element, tell it where is the JSON, it's in this variable, and what's it called? In this case, it's called policy ID, then state code and county. Like I said, I didn't grab much of this data, I just wanted to show how it's done. So what do we have left? What we're doing here is saying, let's grab all of the data. Then we loop through the however many records, and here I exit the loop if the get record number is equals the how many, and that was set at the top. So in this case, I'm telling it once you get to 25, you can stop. And then here it exits this loop, but then it goes back to this loop, which is the one that tells it to go get the next type. So it's going to run back through the types until it has done all of the different construction types. And then at the end, I call one last footer, one last script called export footer, and that's just putting a bow on it at the end, whatever you want that to look like at the end. So, as I say, that all basically results in a very quick, there's a 25 records right there of each kind. And at the end, it tells us that took about 1.5 seconds. All right. Questions? Comments? Concerns?
That's good, Bill. Appreciate it.
Well, all right then. That was easy. I knew I should have dallied around at the beginning of this.
Was that it?
That's all I've got.
Have a copy of the demo file?
Absolutely.
That's the kind of thing. It's like I have to put my hands on it myself.
No, absolutely.
I can watch all I want, but then it's like, because I'm kind of like, I'm a little bit, I think I must have missed. I mean, I was sitting there watching, you're creating the JSON and then you're getting the JSON, but I didn't really see what happened. You did all this stuff to create it. Then how did you get it to Excel? Did you do an export or did you do a...
Yeah, sorry, that's at the very bottom of this. There is an export. And really all it's just doing a straight export.
I zoomed the screen, so I may be missing what's at the bottom. So, okay.
Yeah, yes. So there's an export at the bottom, right after the footer, and then I just do a quick export based on the path at the top. And you'd obviously script all this to look the way you want it, but cool. Depending on how many of those fields you use, and the one I was doing actually used about 20 fields, so it was a good deal more complicated. But I was just really kind of impressed by the idea that you just you start by making a blank slate and you just build it line by line. You have absolute control. And by the way, you can do things there too. I haven't played with this much, but it's absolutely possible to bold and do all kinds of things beyond this. So
like separate tabs and things like that.
I know all that's possible. We actually have done that, but the Excel. So typically what we do is just save as Excel, but it is absolutely possible to just create a file from scratch. It's just ugly, but the Excel format is basically XML wrapped in a zip file,
right?
And so once you have that, you can absolutely build exactly kind of the way we did here. You just start accumulating files and bits and pieces, and you string them together until you have a spreadsheet. And in the end, it really is nothing more than renaming that zip file to XSLX.
Yeah.
And there you go. you have an Excel file.
I don't have any call for this right this minute, but this is the kind of thing that I've been asked to do in the past. Yeah. And it's not practical. I'm not going to say I can do this, but this looks really doable now. So.
It really is. It's just, like I say, it's a matter of just kind of deciding what it looks like and how you're going to do that. But so often it's really nothing more than finding all the values and building out your summaries and just kind of figuring out, like with this one, because you're going back to the data and doing multiple finds, it becomes a looping challenge. It's you have a loop within a loop. All right, well, that's cool. It's just a matter of kind of figuring out which windows go where and which ones have what, and going to the next record, but wait, you weren't in the right context. Let's try again. It's a bit of hit or miss, but I built that little demo starting yesterday. Didn't take too terribly long to do this, and to be fair, I probably did this twice. But the main points I also wanted to make sure of getting across is that this whole thing of the looping of this, for the most part, needs to be scripted, so that the meat of this in the middle of the loop is actually scripted. So when you're trying to figure out how all of this stuff flows, I find it's easier just to take all of this stuff that's in this script and move it, because frankly this is easier just to set aside as a module all into itself, and not you don't run the risk of screwing this up, or if else kind of stuff that might be involved here that you'd mess up by changing things around outside of all that. I love the idea that you can just take a chunk of code and just set it aside, and put it aside into a different script so that you just call it. The only thing you have to do here, though, is I've got to use global variables just to go back and forth. Unless you want to pass data back and forth, and I just don't. So it's also one of the things I'm real careful about, making sure that we delete all that data when we're done. But as I say, I will typically start at the top of any script with setting globals to zeros, to null, just to make sure that I don't have anything hanging up from before.
Right.
So that's my demo. It didn't take all that long.